Good evening, everybody. My name is Neto. I'm a research assistant and law student, currently working on a project with Dr. Randall Block, a primary care physician in Boston, Massachusetts, United States. We only met very recently, but it's been interesting because he had me thinking about our last previous pandemic, Zika. Brazil is suffering now from COVID, and people may forget about it, but it wasn't that long ago, only 5 years ago, that Brazil had a different pandemic, which at the time was enough. Nobody seems to mention Zika very much now, and I wonder why that is. Dr. Bach had a conversation with me just a couple of days ago in beginning this project with me, and it made me start to think about what happened with Zika. We are here to discuss some of his work tonight, and this is just an introduction to our further and ongoing project of Zika, and we're calling it Zika, remember. A lot happened. There were babies with microcephaly born. These unfortunate cases were attributed to Zika infection, although in the years since the theories might very well doubted because the effect has not been reproduced in Brazil nor elsewhere. As a student, I'm interested in this kind of research because I believe it can help to counter misinformation so we can better organize ourselves in order to fight oncoming outbreaks. Doctor?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I've very much enjoyed meeting you and getting to know you. We have only met, only a few days ago, and I was looking out to find somebody in Brazil who could help me kind of get a background and fill in some of the on-the-ground details about Zika. I became interested in Zika frankly, when it happened, I was interested because it was a horrible thing going on. Babies born with small heads, it's called microcephaly. And then this new, previously unheard of infection. And then there were all kinds of dangers, not just for Brazil, but implicit for around the world, particularly in warmer regions, tropical regions, of which there are many all around the equator. There are, probably billions of people living in the tropical zones on Earth. And we were warned that there were going to be, millions or tens of millions of microcephalic babies born in the upcoming years, and there'd be basically no stopping this because there was no vaccine to Zika. And this is, it was a huge news story at the time. And we're going to, spend some time talking about it. But in 2016, right now, coronavirus has somewhat, taken up all of our, pandemic part of our brains, and is all we can really think about in terms of, public health and medicine these days, practically. But Zika was a great pandemic of its own at the time. The Rio Olympics were in 2016, and there was a huge uprooting of travel plans, and economically and business. And I'm not as familiar with Brazil, obviously, as you are, but there were all kinds of uprisings, and the military was called out, and there were lots of public health measures and restrictions on activities and whatnot. I think you'll be able to get to that a little bit better than I. So just to preface, my interest here is to make this story active and vivid again. I don't want to relive any tragedy, but I think it helps to investigate what happened with Zika, because the predictions, frankly, and as you intimate, never quite came true. And that's all to the good. Thank God for that. We're all happy that there are, that didn't turn out to be any, Zika pretty much anywhere else. And insofar as it did show up in a few other places, and I think most recently in India in 2018, there has not been any microcephaly associated with it. So this is a virus, and again, we'll talk kind of in the longer lengths and different episodes about this, but this is a virus that up until that point had never caused any human disease, and it had been around, unlike this current COVID, it had been around since, I guess, known about since 1947. So that's, probably almost 65 years or whatever it was before it was ever seen or thought to be seen in Brazil. And so, it's not that it had been unheard of. It was a virus found in the Zika forest in Uganda, Africa, which is a tropical area, and it had been, able to infect primates, chimpanzees, monkeys, and so forth, but never cause any problem in humans. So the whole story at the time kind of piqued some of my interest a little bit, and I kept it a little bit at the back of my head. I wrote a tiny bit about it, that I did not actually think it was going to be what they said it was, what was happening. And so I'm a little bit of a skeptic, and I tend to hear something and then think about it and then come back to it, and I like to look for answers and things. So I'm not saying necessarily that I know more about Zika than other people. I'm not necessarily saying I'm right about Zika, but I do think it's incredibly curious that something that was going to cause so much damage, in the WHO, the World Health Organization, I know you have a different abbreviation for it in Portuguese.
Yes.
But we call it WHO. What do you call it?
OMS.
OMS. Well, anyway.
Organização Mundial da Saúde.
Whatever we call it, it certainly went out on a limb and said, gave all kinds of pronouncements about how everything was going to be different from then on, and how we should do differently. And a lot of people did change their lives. There were, I can't tell you how many, what the number of pregnancies that didn't happen because of this, because women were in fear of having microcephalic babies if there was any possibility of Zika, and there was no real good testing for Zika at the time. So, people changed their behaviors vastly, and it may seem not that big a deal now that we have even bigger restrictions on our behavior now. And I'm not trying to compare the two precisely, but this was a big deal, and a lot was spent. Both in the loss of business and the loss of opportunity and the loss of wealth that might have happened, like from the Olympics and all kinds of things. There was a lot of upheaval. And, at the time, it was impossible to prove that this actually was the case. People thought it was, and then they talked about it, and more people talked about it, and more people thought it was. And I think it became a little bit like a tornado of activity, and started swirling around itself into something that bigger than otherwise it might have been. So 2 years ago, I thought, I have these thoughts about it. Let's look further into it. And I spent some time looking at some of the facts, such as I could find, about Brazil and the aftermath of the Zika pandemic. And I think there's a lot there to question, top to bottom, how the theory came to be, whether it was actually proved at the time, how those proofs hold up, and what essentially the complete absence of any of their theories' predictions means. If I was joking with you when we met, if I had a theory that if I let go of this cup, it goes up. And every time I let go, it doesn't go up, it goes down repeatedly. How good a theory do I have if my theory that gravity is an upward force doesn't actually pan out? I mean, you might like me, I hope you like me, but you would have to say something else about my theory. Say, I like Dr. Bach, but his theory about gravity going up, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I don't really buy that. And so if everyone made these predictions about all kinds of things that would happen because Zika is there and Zika causes microcephaly, and then none of that happens, has anybody, so I'll stop talking, but I'll ask you, has anybody in Brazil been talking about that in the interim, in these 5 years?
The truth is, I believe Brazil wanted to forget about Zika because, let's say, we're a joyful people. We like to think about joyful things, and Zika, such as COVID, was something that we wanted to go away, we wanted to forget. And of course, there's a big problem. So we don't see people talking about that anymore. Even at the times, the media was like bursting. It was Zika here, Zika there every time, and people just tried to go about. Some people, of course, were scared. People didn't want to leave home, didn't want to go to work. But most of the people, I could say, they just wouldn't care. They wanted to forget the Zika existed, just as they want to try to forget that COVID exists and go with it. Which, as I say again, of course, it is a big problem. One of the big reasons that we need to keep this conversation going. We can't just simply forget this kind of stuff.
Well, I agree with you there. From my taste, the conversation has to keep going because, well, I don't know. I don't know if you ever watched like Law and Order. We have a TV show here, but if you watch half the case, if you watch the first half hour, this happens. Like you want to know. Was he guilty? Which guy was it? Is he gonna get arrested? And any kind of movie, any story, we follow stories maybe more than facts. And so facts to be presented are going to be kind of a dry thing. So I'm going to try to incorporate, and I hope to get your help in incorporating stories into this story so that we can understand the impact that that Zika had at that time. And then going forward from that time and the way people's lives might have been changed. Now, I understand when, a new pandemic is coming around, everybody wants to be extra cautious. So they don't want to, they would rather err, to make a mistake and be too cautious than make a mistake and be too dangerous. So I understand the motivations early on, but overall, when something like that happens, I think most alarms that we get, if we, work in big buildings, you hear an alarm, I think almost everybody understands that is most likely a false alarm. I don't know anybody, I've sat through, I can't even tell you, hundreds of alarms. And there's once in my life when I was probably in my 15 or 16 years old, when it actually was a fire. I got to say, I lived through an actual fire, and I actually lived through an actual tornado. I had a tornado in my building 6 or 7 years ago, and I had a fire when I was very young. So I understand that the real things can happen, that some alarms mean something's happening. But I have to tell you, as far as fire alarms go, I've had hundreds, if not 1,000 different fire alarms. And almost everybody in some of these big office buildings I've been in, fire alarm goes off, everyone just kind of sits there and doesn't move. And somebody has to say, come on, let's go. We all know it's a fake, and we're all going to leave the building. And so, fine. None of the buildings ever been burning. Nobody ever smells smoke. And everybody knows false alarms happen. But for some reason, with something like this, a very improbable thing, a virus nobody's ever heard of, a virus that's never caused any human problems at all, a virus that's very similar to an existing virus, dengue, which is endemic in Brazil from the same mosquito, and which has almost the same kind of virus form and can be cross-reactive. Like they're like cousins, and one can mistake one for the other. Nobody ever said, "Oh, this might just be dengue." First of all, and second of all, when the babies. Some babies had small heads. Again, this is probably something for another story, another day when we can go more into detail. But there was actually, of the original Zika microcephaly connection babies, none of those women had ever been tested for Zika at the time of the pregnancy. And so this part of the story could have been a false alarm or recognized as a false alarm if people had been paying attention or thinking about it skeptically the way they think about every alarm they hear. And so I don't want people to die and ignore a fire alarm. Okay, I understand that you still have to leave the building, you still have to go through the protocol of acting as if it's a real fire. But when you get downstairs and there's no fire, then you have to log it in your head. That was a false alarm. Why did we have the false alarm? Can we fix false alarms? Because the more false alarms you have, the less likely you are to pay attention to the real alarms. I think people can get alarm fatigue. I'm making that word up, but it probably exists. I'm sure people in Israel, when they hear one, there might be missiles coming in, if they hear them enough, I don't think they react as quickly. If they hear them rarely, then they're more likely to trust them and act proficiently and really be on the alert. So I think alarm fatigue, and I'm going to see if I can make that into a real word when we're done here, but I think alarm fatigue is a problem in and of itself, and it can make us overextend our, kind of hyper-aware, our antenna sensibilities, and it takes advantage of us in a certain way. So that's kind of like the intro for this. And just to kind of segue to the next part, and I don't want to spend, again, I don't want to do too much in detail today, but I'm just going to kind of show the article. I think that you had a chance to look at it. Maybe you can comment on certain parts of it as well. So this is I have to preface by saying when I was working on this, I didn't quite feel like Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein discovered general relativity during a solar. I mean, he had discovered it, thought about it earlier, but he actually discovered it during a solar eclipse because he couldn't prove it at any other time except when the moon blots out the sun. So that moment of a solar eclipse, complete darkness, is when he could see the gravitational field of the sun bending the light from stars behind, not really behind, but linearly behind the sun. Huge, earth-shattering moment in science. I bet he felt chills. I didn't have quite that same feeling, but the further I looked into the Zika facts on the ground, the more I was shocked and surprised that there may not actually be that connection. So I'm not sure exactly what the eureka moment was, but I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about a neuropediatrician, a Dr. van der Linden, who's very prominent in Recife, and I'm probably mispronouncing it. I understand it's called Recife, correct?
Yes.
I know, but we see the R there. I've been calling it Recife until recently corrected. And so in Recife, a very prominent physician family, and they've actually gotten more prominent after Zika because she has lectured, in various medical societies and so forth. And I think her parents are physicians, her brothers are physicians, so forth. And she was the one who made the connection between Zika and microcephaly. And there's a whole great story. I think there's a really fascinating personal interest story about the ring of doctors who came up with this idea. And they were not research doctors. They were not in the academy, in the universities. They were what I would call cowboy doctors in a way, not cowboys or gauchos, but actually more in the field individually. And they came up with this idea, and they got the idea together through WhatsApp and chat groups and so forth. And Dr. van der Linden, so the eureka moment for her, which kind of became secondarily my eureka moment, was when she saw two identical twin babies from the same mother, the same womb, and one of the babies, again, I maybe take that back. They were twins. I don't know if they were identical. So let's say fraternal twins. And one of the babies had microcephaly and the other did not. And so she at that moment thought, there had to have been an infective reason for this. And so she had heard about the Zika. She saw the baby with a small head. She said, Zika causes microcephaly. And that was her eureka moment. I have to say, I had the exact opposite reaction to that. When I heard that, I'm like, wait, two twins, same mother, same womb, same mosquito, same Zika traveling through the body, same placenta. Basically they're getting different bloodstreams. I get it, but it's all coming from the same place. And one baby gets a microcephaly, the other doesn't. I don't see how that proved an infectious theory. I really don't. I mean, so I had exactly the opposite. I thought, well, that sounds congenital to me, or random. I mean, a lot of things just happen because they just happen. As far as birth defects and so forth, at our level, we can't really understand. I'm sure there's a reason, but we can't find them yet. But that didn't sound infectious to me. But that kind of got her going on this, and she started, looking at and looking for microcephaly, and it became kind of a news story. And then, in a sense, it attracted more people to wonder about microcephaly. And you had some thoughts about that, if I recall, from the time you were mentioning that, some of the mothers with microcephaly or babies that maybe borderline microcephaly had some financial benefits.
Yes, it's a lifelong benefit from the government. And as far as I know, there were some fraud regarding this benefit, because okay, babies didn't start born with microcephaly yet from the Zika pandemic. They did have this happen before. So the problem is there's a huge cultural differences from Brazil and the US that might be interesting to talk about here. As you said, doctor, you've been through 100 fire drills. I haven't been through any. We don't do that here. So Brazil is a country. It's a very formal country. So even our records, part of our judiciary system, they don't get to be so on hands tight as it's supposed to be, especially when it comes to medical problems. I'll make it's much simple. For example, if you want to travel to another country, a country that requires a visa, you're required to release your fingertips. You need to go through a background check. When you arrive at the airport, there will be someone working there to analyze you, to make questions, to see if you're not lying anything, if you're not doing anything that's supposed to be wrong. In Brazil, it doesn't work like that. In Brazil, even into the prison system, I'll talk a little about that because that's my field. It's very common for people to be arrested just on a loose testimony. And into the medical field, it is also common for just the word of a person without a strong evidence to be used as a basis for granting of benefits, housing, even credit can be granted just on how we say our jeitinho, our way to do things. And this is a huge problem. This is a huge problem, of course, because we have fraud, we have a larger disparity when it comes to income distribution, and overall, I'm not saying the country is a complete mess. We're improving, but these kinds of stuff are regular. So of course, chikungunya was a problem. Dengue is a problem to this day. There's this common correlation between dengue and fever, rashes, and death. But Zika was Zika microcephaly. It was inside everyone's head. No discussion. So if a baby is born with Zika, is born with microcephaly, it was because of a Zika. No testing was required. And that is a problem for science as well, because, as I said, this is in science. There wasn't no evidence, just word of mouth. And unfortunately, that's mostly how things are done here.
That's interesting. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes, and hopefully, we'll probably end in about 10-15 minutes. But I just want to show the article. Now, I tried to preface that I showed this article to. I thought again, it's not quite the Einstein's theory of general relativity, but I do think it's an interesting story that nobody had been covering afterwards. This is like at the time, 2019, 3-4 years afterwards, that nothing had happened with Zika. It hadn't gone anywhere else. Billions of dollars were spent in trying to investigate things, and nobody found any more Zika. So I thought this would be like a new, pretty interesting article for the medical press here. We have the NEJM and the JAMA, major medical journals, or the Lancet, and I submitted it there. I submitted it to science articles. I submitted it to the New York Times and all the big newspapers and wherever else I could, and nobody had any interest in this at all. So it's published in a small magazine called American Greatness, and I'm going to show it the article here. So I did get it published, but it has not it has not really resounded or resonated much anywhere else. So let me see if I can add this to the stream, and we'll try to just. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But we'll just try to go over some of the general points as an overview and maybe highlight some of the things we might come back to. And again, if anybody wants to comment on this and tell us what parts they'd like to hear, I'd be interested in hearing that. So let me just I can put the URL in the comments section later. So some of the major points I want to point out. This is just a quick drawing here. This is something that stood out for me. This is Zika diagnoses or suspected Zika cases in the United States, not in Brazil. And so that number reached 40,000 in U.S. territories in the United States total in the year 2016. It basically went to zero after that. None of these cases really tracked with microcephaly any more than microcephaly exists otherwise. And I like to point out that microcephaly is something that has been going on, as long as humans and frankly other animals have been producing babies. Not every baby comes out perfect, and microcephaly, there's various gradations. There's a true, genuine congenital case of microcephaly, but this didn't track with any of those. And so this is Google Trends on the left, showing how much kind of chatter or discussion there was in the news about Zika, and it's reflected in everyone thinking they have Zika. So I think people, the point of this is to show that people are somewhat suggestible, it seems, and when people stop talking about Zika, people stop complaining of it. So I don't know if the mosquitoes heard about this and they got scared, or maybe there wasn't that much of it to begin with. So I'm not going to go read through the whole article, like I said, but I guess here's the part that I was talking about with the Wall Street Journal. One of the first microcephaly babies to arouse suspicion was a non-identical twin whose brother was completely normal. And microcephaly is usually an inherited genetic condition or caused by the mother's alcohol abuse or other toxins. With her personal assessment that the appearance implied infection, this Dr. van der Linden, she came up with the idea of a new cause, despite the other brothers being completely normal under the same circumstances. And so there's a lot of things going on. I mentioned there was a WhatsApp group of physicians, and this communication happened, and they just made this presumption that microcephaly was more common. The facts later on, this is a very difficult graph to read, and I'm not expecting people to follow it, but I just want to point out that microcephaly was not that well tested, and as Netta was pointing out, the data is not necessarily all that well done. It's done differently in different places. People are different sizes. They're much smaller in Recife and in the kind of Amazonian Indian population in the poverty areas of Recife. So the people are smaller, the babies come out smaller, there's more prematurity, they're poorer, there are probably more toxin exposures. There are a lot of reasons why babies might have smaller heads than average in that area. But as it were, and insofar as data was collected, the years in 2014, early 2015, did not show any increase in Zika. So this over here on the left is the pre-Zika years, and over here is the Zika year. So people thought there was more, but when they looked back and looked at the numbers, there wasn't necessarily more. And again, I think, Neto, you had some interest in this chart, correct?
Yes, I had.
Well, can you? I'll just explain it very briefly. It's hard to see here; it's kind of too small. But the yellow part this here in the middle is the unlike in a lot of American cities. American cities tend to be poorer in the middle, and the wealthy people are in the suburbs. In Brazil and a lot of other places, the wealthier people are in town, in the center city, and the poor people live in some of the how do you say, favelas?
Yes.
Or poorer areas on the surrounding. And so the entire area here is tropical. And so if you were a mosquito, you wouldn't necessarily know if you're, biting somebody here. I mean, the mosquitoes can't tell this kind of stuff. They can't tell wealth and so forth. But as it were, the cases of microcephaly are in red. The center of the city is very populous, but the actual rate of microcephaly is higher in the somewhat less dense areas further on the outskirts, which happen to be poorer. So it very much tracked with poverty. Did you have any thoughts about this?
Yes, I do. First, about the distribution of wealth in Recife and Brazil in general. Just through a little historical context, is because Well, Brazil was one of the oldest countries from the Western countries to abolish slavery. Abolished it in
Abolish slavery.
1888.
Wow.
And at that time, the slaves had nowhere else to go, so they were pushed away from the centers of the town and where they established their favelas. That's a phenomenon in Rio de Janeiro, in São Paulo, and in Recife as well. And when we compare the wealthiest regions of Recife, like Boa Viagem, which is, we call it bairros, which are neighborhoods. The Boa Viagem is a wealthy neighborhood. Torre, Casa Amarela, these are places where we have people to collect your trash on the ground. We don't have open sewage running around. We have security. People have protection. And when it comes to the poorest regions, like Pina, for example, which is just at the very end of Boa Viagem, it's a place with huge buildings and just in front of the beach, we have little shanty towns. People have to live with open sewage, which in turn attracts mosquitoes. And most people won't be able to afford air conditioning, for example, and that their illness that are associated with poverty, as you wrote in your article. So yes, this correlation between income and neighborhoods and cases of Zika, it's on point because it's the reality of Brazil. Of course, a wealthy person isn't immune to Zika because people go around, they travel, they still get in contact with mosquitoes. But people with lower income or people who live in lower income neighborhoods have this much higher contact with poverty-inducing diseases, and that's why I believe the cases of Zika were much more prominent in these areas.
Interesting. So, I mean, it could be that, I mean, that map doesn't necessarily disprove the mosquitoes, because there could be more mosquitoes in those parts of town, is what you're saying. But there's also a lot of other stuff happening with things that existed before and exist since, with that might cause smaller head circumference babies, more prematurity, and so forth. There's probably more alcohol use amongst the poor. There's probably more exposure to any other toxins that might cause this. The people are smaller to begin with. There's probably more prematurity. And one other factor which I'm still a little bit puzzled on, and I haven't quite gotten an answer on, is whether the head measurement charts that were used for comparison on these babies was developed from Brazil as a whole, because the South is more European and there's a huge height differential. The Europeans are taller, and there's more wealth, more consistent access to good nutrition, etc. And so people are taller in the southern cities than they are in the northern poor sections of barrios and so forth, favelas. So I don't know whether the actual data might have been kind of turbocharged by the fact that they're comparing babies from the smallest people in one of the smaller, shorter stature areas of Brazil, one of the poorer parts of Brazil, all those things confounding and putting together, and then they're putting them on a chart where the babies are, kind of from the more populous and bigger and taller, better nourished area of southern Brazil. So I'm wondering whether the whole thing kind of like added on, with a wrong differential. There's a whole aspect of how the microcephaly was measured and which microcephaly it was, and we'll again maybe get to that in later episodes about the measurement part. But I don't want to spend too much more time on this tonight. I did want to maybe just go over two of the other charts that are part of this. This one here is again a little bit of a busy chart, and I apologize. But at the left, you see a map of Brazil. The central part, Amazon, so forth, is much less populated. Most of the population, as with China, is coastal on the eastern coast. And each one of these circles is population. You can see the thousands of inhabitants here. So these, if it's a thousand, that's a million. And so these are the biggest cities down in the south. We're talking about the Recife being up here in the kind of the northeast. But the mosquito belt was technically all of Brazil, but certainly all of the most tropical parts. The equator is, if I'm not mistaken, right about here. I could be wrong. Maybe it's a little bit lower, but the equator is right about here. So this is all tropical, wet area, and mosquitoes would have been all through this area. On the right side of the chart, we see that this is microcephaly rates after the supposed Zika exposure. The numbers were highest over here. These are the highest numbers of cases of supposed microcephaly, and the provinces, it's kind of, they're all connected by these little red lines. Again, sorry about this, but for the people who know Brazil, you'll see that the provinces up in the far north had very low rates, and the provinces in the south had very low rates. The highest rate are the ones where people were talking most about microcephaly, in Paraíba and Pernambuco. And so, again, I think this is similar to the chart we showed at the beginning about the Google Trends. I think there's some suggestibility about talking about microcephaly and people getting interested about it and then worrying about it. And whether they're worrying about it for good reasons, bad reasons, I can't really say. But that is something to think about and talk about. So, do you have any thoughts about any of that?
As you said, the northeastern regions of Brazil, they are poorest regions. Like in most of the wealth are concentrated in both the south and southern part of Brazil, mostly São Paulo, because São Paulo has 44 million inhabitants. Brazil has 260 million people. So one single state has almost 1/4 of the population. So of course São Paulo is the richest state. It's of course a little difficult to use São Paulo as a measurement because since it's so rich, everyone wants to go there. But if we compare the northeastern part of Brazil to directly to the south, like Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, the differences are enormous. Many people call Santa Catarina as the best state to live in Brazil. Of course, it's more expensive to live there, but the temperatures are nicer. The jobs have higher incomes, and overall, both their human development index, I can't say the right abbreviation in English, is much higher than it is in my region, which is the northeast. And as I said, another reason why, because another reason why the northeastern part of Brazil may be so poor is because there are many harbors here that used to bring in slaves to the country, and many of these slaves have never left. So historically, this kind of contributes to why the region is so poor. And I believe that its temperature as well was. Many of the diseases were brought from Africa. Many of the modern diseases that Brazil came here, I believe, because of this slave trading. So that the region in particular, with more Zika cases and more cases of, I believe, microcephalic babies as well, they are vulnerable per se. So it may be even easier to gather data compared to directly the southern part of Brazil, where people are taller, as you said. It's not the same thing to compare a baby from the south and a baby from the northeast.
Right.
There are these huge differences that may be important.
Okay, so I'm going to end just after this next chart. I appreciate what you said, and I understand. These are again things we're kind of going over quickly. And we're going to try to back up some of this more with data and on a regular format, and talk with some Brazilians on the ground at some later dates as well, we hope. I kind of want to end with the kind of the failed prediction and what Zika was doing in those years. So this is again a busy kind of chart, and I apologize to my audience for that. Hopefully I can make it scary. It actually frightens me when I look at it. So I'll try to make sense of it insofar as I can. So the top one here, this is from, I believe, the New England Journal of Medicine, and my comments are in red, but this blue line here. This is the original Zika in 2015. So this is the amount of Zika supposedly that was there, relatively speaking. And I guess it's somewhat, I don't know if it's seasonal or just kind of came and went. So original Zika, then you have to add 9 months, because that's how long it takes a baby to gestate. And then, so the arrow goes 9 months in time, and then it's going to go downward. So it goes 9 months over, then downward to how much microcephaly there was. And again, this is a very busy chart. This kind of purple is Zika infection. So so they saw microcephaly and Zika together here. So they said, oh my God, original Zika 2015. And again, this is a little bit tricky to show. The original Zika, it goes boom, it shows produced microcephaly. And actually the microcephaly is in darker thing. This is in this line over here is microcephaly. So then the next year, there's more Zika. It comes back, and so you're going to expect that there's going to be, and this is the dotted line, you're going to expect a predicted amount of microcephaly the following year, 2016 into 2017, and lo and behold, this is the big red lines here show how much microcephaly actually showed up. It was near zero. Once they actually got more refined with their, once microcephaly was kind of on their in their radar or in their sights, they started to look more carefully and apply stricter criteria. And so once they did that, lo and behold, they didn't find really any microcephaly burst. Again, there's always going to be some, because that's part of the human condition so far. On a random basis, but they did not find, after the second big burst of Zika out in the wild, they didn't find 9 months later any microcephalic babies. So that was the first failure in prediction. That was as early as 2016. Now, before we close, did you hear about that part of the failure of that theory back in 2016? I mean, I know you're a young guy, you had other things on your mind. But did you hear about it from any of your relatives? Anyone say, oh my God, we're so relieved that Zika didn't cause any more of these microcephaly babies? Did that ever come up in the news? Or?
So, as I said before, Zika kind of faded away from the minds of the Brazilians. But when Brazilians think about a disease, it's not because the disease is there, because the media is talking about it. I mean, exactly. we still have problems with dengue today. There's people dying of this more severe cases of dengue in the hospitals, together with people from COVID. But no one talks about it anymore. It's not the disease of the moment, so no one is worried.
Right.
Brazil doesn't have to worry only about COVID, as people think. Oh, I don't want to go to the streets because of COVID. No, we have plenty of other diseases, especially in the northeastern part of Brazil, to worry about. It's not only COVID. People believe that the disease that the media is talking about is the only problem out there. So it came to a certain. I have two perspectives on the matter. One was when I was a high school student. Was when Zika was in its all-time high. I was from a little town, and people didn't really care much about it, but the cases started coming, and everyone was worried, hysterical. And I did hear about some cases where people were born with microcephaly around that time, but there were so little cases. I've talked about people this previous day. Hey, do you know someone who was born with microcephaly due to Zika? And then the answer is the same. Maybe one, or I don't. Maybe we just start to notice babies being born with microcephaly, because I don't know, when a baby is born with some kind of disability, people don't go and say, "Hey, my baby was born with disability."
Right.
There was this association, Zika, microcephaly. So when one baby was born, like, everyone knew about it, and I know of this only one case.
Right.
And it suddenly dropped. Like no theories failed. People simply forgot about it because the media stopped talking about it.
Right.
So that was it.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to, I think that we have a lot of other things to talk about, but I think that we might be done for tonight. What do you think?
I think it was a very good start.
Yeah,
A good
I hope so.
point.
All right. So I'm going to hope that some people get to watch this. I'm going to do a little bit to promote it. We certainly would like to hear any questions you have about it, comments, criticisms, opposing views. Disagree with us, please. You don't have to be convinced. We're happy to have you along for the ride. And if your opinions are strong, maybe we'll have you on the broadcast and discuss it. I would like to, I say this as a journey and an adventure. I certainly don't minimize any mother who has a microcephalic baby or that child as well. It's a huge sadness. Poverty is a sadness. Open sewers, a sadness. There are many, many sadnesses, but if we want to deal with them, we have to deal with them constructively. We can't fight this problem by spending our money and attention on something that is not a problem and doesn't exist. So we can't fight poverty by fighting, what I personally think might very well have been a mystical Zika infection, or if it was there, a Zika infection that doesn't cause a particular problem. So if you want to fight poverty, think about ways of fighting poverty, get people more educated, try to bring companies in, business and all that kind of stuff, and help everyone rise. But I don't think we're helped. And this became, in a way, and we'll talk. I think that just as a bookmark for future talk, I think this Zika became a way of dealing with social issues and kind of changing the narrative. In wrestling, or there are certain moves you try to flip the person, and some people I think might have used the Zika moment, the Zika in the news, to try to slide in other political motivations and interests. I don't know if you just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down whether you think that's a possibility. Okay, so we'll see about some of those things, and if again, if people have comments or interests or questions on any of those topics, I'd be certainly interested. I'm not claiming to be an expert on this. I've never set foot in Brazil. I speak no Portuguese. I like Brazil. I'd love to go sometime, but it's not the Brazil part for me. As much as what was that part? Like, was that a real thing? How do we adjudicate? How do we get to the second part of Law and Order, where we find the actual verdict and we find out who was innocent, who was guilty? Can we make Zika innocent, and can we let people have the relief of knowing that this is one less problem about which they need to worry? And if we can give that to the world, I think that's a gift. So that's all I've got. And again, if I'm wrong, then they should worry. But I think the jury's out. Okay. Anything else? Do you have anything to add, Neto?
I believe we need to keep the research going. We need to keep the conversation rolling. Not even in the United States, it's where you are, but maybe in Brazil as well, because we don't, as a community, think about these problems the way we're supposed to be. So talking about it, and most importantly, engaging, can help us, grow and tackle these issues the way that they're supposed to be tackled. Science using our heads.
That would be a nice thing. All right, so I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you so much. I appreciate your help, and we'll talk soon.
It was my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.